Well, it was just a matter of time before I finally decided to make this video. I originally wasn't going to do it, but ever since I got this comment on my Calamity video, I decided that it's finally time to rank Infernum bosses from worst to best. I will rank them in tiers like in my Calamity video, only difference is that I will also be including vanilla bosses since they are completely different in this mod. But I won't be including any mini bosses since they were not that interesting to me. Let's just waste no time and talk about these bosses. I decided again not to start with F tier, which I'll explain later. Instead, we're starting with Old Duke. This boss is just annoying. The main problem I have with him is the charges. Not only are they not telegraphed well enough, not only does he track your movement with this attack, but he deals a lot of damage if he hits you. And the footage you're seeing is fighting Old Duke after the Devour. And if you fight him before the dog, his health is insanely big. He's also just really bland and uninteresting compared to some other bosses. So why didn't I put him in F tier? Well, at least he doesn't ruin the experience of playing Infernum. Plus he is completely optional, so if you don't want to fight him, you don't have to. Still, this won't excuse him for being a trash boss. Overall, there are only two bosses that I absolutely hate fighting. First one was Old Duke, and now Eater of Worlds is next. The reason why I dislike it so much is how it can be a complete mess of a fight. The main gimmick here is once you take down the worm, it will split in two and now you'll have more things to look after. It can be sometimes a bit too much, but it's still manageable. But once you take down their health, there will be 4 worms and even more projectiles. RNG plays a big role here since sometimes they'll keep charging at you, shoot so many projectiles that split into more, spawn thorns to restrict your movement even more. But other times they'll only do the charges. I don't have a problem with dodging billions different things at once. Most of the pre-hard mode bosses balance things well since you don't have a full kit yet. Not the Eater of Worlds though, screw him. Also for the record, I won't be including the Brain since I only fought it once and that was in multiplayer with friends. Still, I would probably put it above the Eater. I mean, it's King Slime. What else to say about him? I guess it's cool that a ninja shows up to spice up the things a bit. And there is a crystal that shoots pellets, and the king jumps around, and he dies. Alright, that's it. Next boss. This will be brief again because I don't have a lot to say about Cryogen. I like the new sprite Infernum gives him. He's more challenging than his Calamity counterpart. Not a bad boss, but he's incredibly mediocre. Ravager on the other hand has seen a lot of improvements. Now he feels like an actual boss with some fun attacks like the walls coming to crush you. With that said, why is he not higher than D tier? For me, that is because there isn't really anything unique that you haven't seen already. Plus he is still very similar to Golem, which also brings him down. Still, I would take this any day compared to whatever his fight is in Calamity. I still feel the same about Dragonfolly in Inferno. Fun little fight before you fight some actual bosses. Some attacks look cool like electric feathers and lasers, and that's really it. Alright, now let's finally move on to some actual interesting bosses. I don't understand the ground slams. Sometimes they don't hit you. Sometimes they will be extremely tall. Sometimes they reach you. Sometimes they won't. My only tip is to stay airborne and hope for the best. But second phase shakes up the fight with the hands that will fall from above, the laser that you have to avoid, being restricted in a much smaller space and destroying the hands to damage their clubs. I also like how you can just walk under their clubs to dodge certain attacks instead of flying over him. Also, his death animation is cool. The Cultist isn't mechanically deep or difficult, but man do I get to enjoy this short but fun fight. Fireballs, lightnings and ice shards aren't too difficult to dodge since they're always well telegraphed, but the animations are really pretty. He also limits the arena that you are fighting in, but this is barely noticeable since it's already big. He also has a desperation phase after you deplete his health down to 0%, which becomes almost common in every fight after Moonlord. But I think this is the first one to actually have this and is a nice little surprise, though it's easy to avoid, just stay as far away as you can. Skeletron Prime is stupidly easy compared to the Destroyer and the Twins, which is kind of jarring, especially if you fight him after you've beaten the other two mechs. On the other hand, I do like that the hands have a shared health bar instead of each hand having its own health. It doesn't drag the fight. In Phase 2 he will start shooting spikes, rockets, skulls and will start charging at you. But whenever he charges at you, he will send additional spikes that you must avoid. So now you must not only time your dodge, but also worry about positioning. And it wouldn't be an Infernum boss if he didn't shoot giant lasers. I used to hate this boss on my first playthrough, but after fighting him multiple times, I kinda like this fight, with the exception of the droids. They can be a nuisance, like in this clip where I had to position myself correctly to avoid the beams. Then out of nowhere a droid shows up to get a cheap hit on me. On the topic of lasers, I like how they change the shapes the further you get in the fight. And yeah, there will be a lot of lasers, but it doesn't feel too overwhelming like with the Eater of Worlds. I want to answer this comment asking me where I would put the Primordial Worm, and it would probably be in C tier as well. Difficult fight, yes, but not engaging enough to be higher. As for Infernum version, he is okay as well. I decided to put him here because he has way too many attacks where you can't damage him and it needlessly drags the fight. But the main reason why he is here is the difficulty. If you thought fighting Skeletron Prime after the other two mechs was easy, it has nothing compared to the Eidolon Worm, or Primordial, whatever his name is now. Let me put it this way, you fought Poltergast, which was a really hard boss. Then after that you fought the Devourer of Gods, probably the highest difficulty spike in the whole mod. And then after him you fight Yaron, which is another roadblock for many players. And then comes Eidolon Worm, who has really easy to dodge patterns. But then after him you have Exomex and Calamitas, who are again massive difficulty spikes. It's just so bizarre, I don't understand why they made him so easy. Now I may have sounded like I dislike this boss, but I really don't. I like the part where the Terminus starts attacking you. Plus, I really like the new music for him. It fits perfectly with a giant beast that is guarding the abyss. Cygnus is in C tier because of one attack that he loves to use and is really hard to predict. This one where a bunch of slashes will appear without warning. He uses it constantly and it ruins otherwise a pretty good boss. His attacks are mostly a bullet spam that is fun to dodge. He also summons the clone of himself in Phase 2, but from what I've noticed they only do charges together, so it isn't like a synchronized gang fight like the other gangs in this mod. Last C tier boss is Wall of Flesh, who I usually dislike in vanilla game, but in this one it's pretty solid. Main gimmick here is to defeat all 4 eyes that will occasionally shoot a giant beam so you can damage the main body. But you don't actually get rid of the eyes, you just detach them and they will start circling you around and shoot lasers at you. and it becomes this fun rhythm where you try to avoid both giant beam and lasers coming from different directions. And the music is awesome. But that's it for C tier. Now we move to bosses that I really enjoy. This boss is right in the middle of high C, low B tier. I decided to put her here because I like the new attacks she gets in phase 2. As for her other attacks, well, they are serviceable but not really groundbreaking or anything. And I know I'll say this like a billion times throughout the video, but I really like the soundtrack she gets. Also, she has Plaguebringer Goliath's motif. I wonder why. Now this is a big improvement, going from low D tier all the way to B. Stormweaver is a short but engaging fight, from sending bunch of lightnings, electric orbs, to this attack where it circles around you while sending more electric orbs towards you. And I really like this attack where he teleports in and out. I just wish it had more health so I can enjoy the fight more. This will most likely be a first boss for many players, and it's a well-made first boss. I know King Slime is technically a first boss, but who cares about him? Since you don't have access to dash and since your flight time is relatively short, devs did a fine job making this boss difficult enough where it doesn't feel unfair to fight it. I especially like how if you want to avoid his charges, you must trick him to dash in a wrong direction. And the spikes that stay on the ground add even more complexity to this boss. There are certain situations where you won't be able to dodge everything, but those moments are extremely rare, and even if they happen, they don't ruin this boss as a whole. The intro phase was cool at first, but in later attempts it becomes an annoyance, and I also felt like the first phase was too easy. But phase 2 and 3 make up for the lackluster first phase. I love when gang fights do synchronized moves, and you see it constantly in second phase. Third phase is the toughest, where you only have Commander to kill, but he will not let you do that so easily. From charges that require careful positioning, spears that split in smaller spears, and a twist on typical laser attack where it will do lasers again to trick you. And the animations and effects are beautiful. I usually fight the Scourge after the eye is beaten, and I think it affects my enjoyment of this boss, because I really like dashing left and right while avoiding the Scourge. The Scourge also has a lot of changes to him, like how he can slow you down with wind while a ton of pellets are coming from both directions, and how he can go underground. He will either summon tornadoes or small pellets that go upward and then fall. It's a nice up in difficulty from the eye. I imagine this will be many first-time players a first real roadblock. It was for me at least. He was really hard, but not unfair or stupid. It forced me to adjust to his attacks if I wanted to survive, like this one where he limits your space while sending small skulls from his hands and his head. It will be overwhelming at first, but after few trials and errors, you'll start to appreciate the boss. Well, at least I did. The penultimate boss of hard mode, Moonlord, was for the most part done really well. In this fight, if you want to damage the main body, you must first take out the 3 eyes first. And once you take one down, the eye will start doing the attacks on its own. You also have a restricted arena like in Calamitas' fight, and it works fine enough. But the main part I really dislike is when you take out the second eye. It gains new attacks, which is great, but it will constantly do these sequences of attacks where you can't damage the final eye until those sequences are over. And it happens way too many times. It just drags the fight for no reason. Still, I like some of the attacks like the giant black hole, and the visuals are amazing. It really gives the sense of fighting an eldritch god. My main issue with Astrum Aureus is it was too bland and generic besides its pretty design. but this Ashram Aureus is anything but generic. It now has some cool looking attacks that are fun to dodge, like the slams, which are not only followed by a shockwave but also with bunch of projectiles. And the slams get more complex with the addition of small rockets that home in on you. And it also has a unique type of big laser attack where it will send lasers from both sides that nearly close while also shooting bunch of projectiles. As a whole, the fight is challenging but not overwhelmingly difficult, and it didn't make me fall asleep while fighting it, so it gets bonus points for that. I don't have anything to say about this boss mechanically, since she is similar to her Calamity counterpart, with the exception of this attack where you are temporarily trapped in this circle, as well as changes to her regular attacks. But I do like the addition of her death animation, as well as finding Calamity's paying respects to her. Good lord, is this boss controversial. People either love this fight or absolutely despise it. And for the record, I did initially hate this boss, but that is why I replayed the mod multiple times, just so I can get a better understanding of these bosses and how to handle them. As of now, I do like Poltergast, but that doesn't mean I won't be criticizing it. First of all, you really need a much bigger arena than what you're given. I've done Sislig's Void and his arena was perfect for the fight, but for the Poltergast it is way too small, especially since he's a projectile heavy boss. His structures are also just weird, like in here where they are circling projectiles and the boss just wobbles back and forth before going full swing on you, and for some reason you can't damage him while he's doing this attack. And yeah, my first playthrough definitely affected how much I like this boss. Now for the positives. I do like this attack where he splits into a bunch of smaller variants and they start doing coordinated attacks, and this spiral attack that feels reminiscent of Undertale. And once you figure out the way to dodge his various barrages of projectiles, it does become more enjoyable. Also, his design is just raw. I'll just say this, I never liked Queen Slime in vanilla game, and I wasn't really excited to fight it in Infernum. I didn't think I would like it. But would you know it, I actually think this boss is good, and almost great. Instead of relying on a bunch of mobs that will annoy you and ton of hard to see projectiles, they made her into a beautiful boss with well telegraphed attacks. I mean, the gameplay just speaks for itself. I don't even have to tell you why it's good. And the last B tier boss is Crabylon. The first phase is kind of similar to the original one, but with the addition of blue clouds, spikes and a lot of mushrooms. The phase 2 is where it gets interesting. Crabylon will detach his claws to slam the ground, which will send a ton of mushrooms falling from above. Now this may sound boring compared to some previous bosses, but I don't care, I'll always have a blast while fighting this boss, even if it's not too complex or difficult. And I'll say it again, music is great. Finally, I get to talk about a good Fishron fight and not that one. So what makes Duke Fishron a great fight? Well, it's all about the flow. It starts off slowly to get you used to his attacks. As you deplete his health, he will pick up the speed and add some new attacks to the mix. But it doesn't feel cheap since you are already familiar with his attacks. Now you just have to be more reactive. And it all ramps up in the final phase where he has some new attacks and will start teleporting around and dash into you even faster, but not too fast, unlike in that stupid fight. So get out of here, old Duke. Duke Fishron will always be better. Plantera's phase 1 is uninteresting, so I'll just skip to phase 2. This boss will restrict your movement as much as possible with poison clouds and vines. Careful movement is a key here. Her attacks are also more difficult here, like this one where you must fit in this gap to avoid her vines that she sends once, but later she will do it twice in a row. And this phase is a true bullet hell with so many projectiles coming from everywhere, but it's still manageable since you're given a huge arena to fight it. This will probably be the most controversial placement. Look, I still like Exomex, but I would be lying if I didn't say that I really dislike Thanatos. I didn't like him in regular Calamity that much either, but in here it's a different story. I hate how spammy he can be with his projectiles. I hate how he can just start dashing at you without warning, and I hate fighting him with other mechs. It feels even more chaotic and not in a fun way. Now that I'm done with Thanatos, I can talk about the good parts, which are Ares and the twins. Individually, they are great. I like the addition of the swords Ares has, and when you fight both him and the twins, it's without a doubt the best part of the fight. And they also have a unique soundtrack, which is of course great. That and some great visuals push this boss to A tier. Or technically bosses. I was surprised when I found out that there is a secret optional boss you can fight in Infernum, and it's a very unique fight. The first phase is like a methodical 1v1 duel, like you're fighting another player, and it's an awesome back and forth. The second phase drastically shifts the fight into a gang boss, and again Infernum does a great job with this duo. The shark will be the most aggressive, while Argus will keep throwing projectiles. And in the final phase, Argus will become furious and will do anything to kill you. Now there is one problem that I have with this fight in specific. Since this is a human boss, it can be hard to hit him, although this depends on which weapon you're using. Also, I just noticed that in this fight your flight time is reduced to half, meaning you can't just hover in the air constantly. Just a cool boss overall. Yes, I know. I already did this in my Calamity ranking, and I'm doing it again. But since I fought the Hive Mind more than the Perforator, I'll mostly talk about the Hive Mind. This boss takes the concept of, well, being a Hive Mind and expanding on it, summoning minions, poison pellets, covering a huge portion of arena in deadly rain while teleporting around. Later adding spewing fire from its head, sending corruptors from left and right, and doing various bullet hell attacks. This fight is an improvement from the original for being more fast-paced and more tense towards the end, and for having cool effects. This is yet another well-made duo boss. It's the classic gang fight where the one is the most aggressive while the other does ranged attacks. It's not unique, you've seen this in almost every gang fight. But there are some twists to the fight to make it stand out, like doing a bunch of synchronized attacks, or when you take one's HP down to 5%, you can't kill it until you kill the other, like in this clip. I am not able to kill Spasmatism, and now I am forced to kill Retinizer. But the fight doesn't end there, because once you kill one of them, the other will heal his health back and now has completely new attacks. Out of the three mechanical bosses, this is by far the hardest one, but also the best. I just love good duo bosses. Astrum Deus is another projectile-heavy worm boss, but the reason why I like this boss is because of the visuals and animations. They are so pretty to look at. It's not mechanically too deep, just mostly dodging projectiles and avoiding the worm, but the visuals make up for it. And this laser attack looks so pretty. Golem is probably the worst boss in Terraria. The fight is just uninteresting and boring, and he is not a threat at all. So, how did the devs fix this fight? Well, by turning it into an Undertale fight. Straight up. Every problem that I had with the Golem was fixed here. The attacks feel varied and interesting, and the fight is actually challenging. The first phase is where you learn his attacks and how to dodge them. The second phase is where it becomes really tense since the floor is now filled with spikes. To balance this out, you constantly get platforms that will go up and disappear. I really don't have any complaints about this boss. They did the golem justice he deserved. This might be one of the most unique fights in the mod. The first phase is entirely in water. That sounds awful, but surprisingly it controls super well, and you're given infinite flight. The attacks from the Scourge range from charges, poison bubbles, or shedding its sharp bones that home in on you. There is also a giant bubble that appears periodically to help you from getting rid of poison while being in the water. Phase 2 is spent above, but it's pretty short since it starts once the boss is at 20% health. It does have new attacks like a giant acidic tornado. The fight isn't difficult, it's like one of the easier bosses, but you can't deny how brilliant this boss is. Also, his death animation is gruesome, and I love it. Basically Plaguebringer Goliath, but with more projectiles and more complex attacks, like charges now leaving either orbs or radioactive stings. Two attacks that stand out are this one where you must take out the drones that block your way, and this one where you must destroy the giant nuke. It sounds insane, and it is. Another well-made duo boss. Who would have guessed? I'm ranking it as the highest A tier boss because of two reasons. One, it's an awesome synchronized gang. Trying to avoid the projectiles of both slimes just feels great. And two, once you take out both slimes, the core will become the boss in a surprising twist, dashing around, sending tons of projectiles and more. And just like in my Calamity ranking, this is the best pre-hard mode boss. Now we are finally done with A tier, and there are still 8 more bosses. That should tell you how good these fights will be. I've been saying a lot how certain bosses have great visuals and animations. However, this boss is on whole another level of spectacle. This might be. Actually no, it is the most beautiful fight in the entire mod. Well, unless you're me who can get the stable performance. But I personally don't mind it, since I can still enjoy the fight mechanically. If you want to beat this boss, you must learn how to dodge him. And when I say to dodge him, I mean that literally. You must use your iframes you get while dashing into the Devourer left and right. And this is where I'm torn a bit. On one hand, when you finally get the hang of the fight, it is one of the most thrilling battles. But on the other hand, if you mistime your dash, your punishment is a substantial HP loss. And yeah, my first playthrough was a painful one. However, just like with the OG, it wasn't too exhausting to fight him. And I was getting better and better at it. It is by far the hardest boss in this mod, and the most satisfied I felt after defeating such a difficult challenge. Calamitas' clone was completely changed in Infernum. Now she is more humanoid and her attacks are nothing like the original Calamitas. She is no longer just a stepping stone to the real Calamitas. She is now a completely unique boss, with her shooting out tons of projectiles, lasers, and doing this spiral attack. Eidolon Worm does have that attack as well, but Calamitas was the first one to show this attack. Even the Brothers phase is different, where they have a shared health bar and do synchronized attacks. In the final phase, she will get desperate by doing a giant bullet hell and then constantly dash at you. This is what Calamitas' clone should have been. I like that fight, but I do think she should have been more unique. And that's what Calamitas' Shadow attempts to do, and accomplishes it. Yes, I am ranking Ceaseless Void this high because I love this fight that much. I love the new attacks, the effects, the animations, the background, everything is on point. I especially like how in the first phase he is completely stationary and locked up in chains, telling you that this thing is locked up here for a reason. And the arena you get perfectly works for this boss since you have enough space to dodge his projectiles, especially when he becomes furious in second phase. You hear that, Poltergast? Plus, the camera is zoomed out so you can clearly see the projectiles more clearly. He was the best Sentinel boss in Calamity ranking, and now he is even better. This is still my favorite gang fight. The changes to this boss fight aren't that big in here, but are still noticeable, like the exclusion of these small annoying fish minions that were my least favorite part of the original fight are now completely gone, and the attacks are different and more fun to dodge. I unfortunately don't have much to say about this boss, not because it's boring, just that it's a slightly better fight than the original. And you can argue that some bosses should be higher than them. But man, I still adore this duo. I always will. For Providence, on the other hand, I have so much to say. First of all, I love the new location Infernum adds to fight Providence. It adds even more to the world building. As for the fight itself, it obviously outdoes the original in almost every way. I adored the original Providence, but this one is on a whole another level of quality. First phase starts with a brief opening of Providence waking up while you dodge her projectiles. Then the fight begins, with pellets falling from above while Providence shoots exploding fire orbs, then starts shooting a bunch of spears and summoning guardians to help her in the fight. All sounds good until you knock her health to 70%. The attacks in this phase are even more difficult, with her throwing spears that summon pillars of fire, giant fireballs, or shooting a bunch of smaller fireballs. After some time she will disappear and summon her crystal to do even more different attacks, and that includes lasers and even more fire. What I love so much about this boss is how fair it is to the player. Every single attack is telegraphed well enough and you can clearly see them when they're about to show up, without relying on luck. And the spectacle of this fight is amazing. Not quite like with the Devourer, but it does feel like you're fighting a sun goddess. Yaron is the boss that I changed my opinion on him the most. When I first fought him, I hated him with a passion. I thought he was way too quick and did so much damage. Then after another playthrough, I liked him a lot more. And now after beating him again, he became my third favorite fight. What I didn't like about Yaron was how fast he was with his charges, and how my dashes weren't quick enough to dodge him. But then I realized something. I'm an idiot. It's not just about timing your dash, it's about dashing and then position yourself to avoid the next one. And that was the moment when this fight finally clicked with me. His other attacks are mostly similar to the OG but only faster and more complex. But then there is a second phase, which starts after you take the first health bar down. You heard that right. They brought back the mechanic that made Yaron so memorable, that being the fight having two separate health bars. Second phase is even harder. Yaron will be much faster and more difficult to avoid, and you have to worry about projectiles coming from different directions. This phase was really hard for me because I couldn't handle everything. But once I finally got the flow of it, it became almost methodical and like a dance. Also, I get to listen to Roro the Jungle Dragon even longer, so he gets bonus points for that. Here's a question. What do you get when you mix Touhou with Terraria? Well, you get this. Empress of Light is a phenomenal boss. her attacks have almost no RNG, but are very difficult to get the grasp on. Every attack requires a very specific way of dodging and avoiding, like her Sword of Dance move, which is probably one of the most satisfying attacks to dodge. She also gets more difficult the more you fight her, eventually turning into a giant moon that shoots lasers. Because why wouldn't she? And she also has one of the best soundtracks. When you combine all of that with amazing visuals, you get a masterpiece of a boss. No joke, I don't think this boss has any flaws. Everything is on point here. She would have been number 1. Hell, I was considering it at some point, if it wasn't for a certain Brimstone Witch. And shock to absolutely no one, Supreme Calamitas takes the crown again. Now, there is something that I said in my Calamity ranking video about Scal. I basically said that she's the best final boss I fought. And I don't really agree with that take anymore. I still think she's the best fight, but the best final boss? No, not really. However, Infernum Supreme Calamitas is not only the best final boss I fought, but goes beyond that. She might be one of my favorite bosses, like ever. It begins just like the OG with Sepulcher, only this time it's an actual threat that you have to take down. Calamitas' attacks are of course harder, throwing projectiles much more sporadically, doing dashes that end up with exploding projectiles, teleporting around and throwing homing magic. Once at 75%, she will summon a Hydra that will throw even more projectiles, and Calamitas will gain new attacks, including a giant laser. Then, when she is at 45%, her brothers will spawn, who now have a shared health bar and do synchronized moves. Once her brothers are dead, she will gain even more attacks, including yet another beam attack, and the fight in this phase becomes a true bullet hell. She will do anything to finally kill you. You must pay attention to your surrounding and look out for any projectiles coming your way. And after all of that, once you finally take her down, she reveals her desperation phase, which is by far the hardest one to deal with. All of the lessons you learned throughout the mod are put to test here. Careful positioning, timing your dashes, clever use of heals and teleporting, she has everything a final boss should have. Difficult but fair attacks, awesome visuals and a phenomenal soundtrack. She might not be as difficult as the Devourer or Yaron or Exomax, but the difficulty isn't everything, and this boss perfectly understands that. And that's finally it for Infernum. Now I want to give my final thoughts on the mod as a whole. Overall, this mod is incredible. I love the reworks for the bosses and some new additions. But good lord, the difficulty spikes can be insane like in Endgame. But still, I had a lot of fun with this mod. And I had a lot of fun ranking the bosses. I might do these types of videos more in the future, but with different games, so it isn't just Terraria. I'll still be doing videos on specific games, but I'll have these as well. Thanks for watching and Happy New Year, everyone.